In the dusty frontier town of Cedar Ridge, justice was supposed to be as reliable as the morning sun. For 20 years, Sheriff James Sullivan had been the law, respected by honest folks and feared by outlaws throughout the territory. But on a cold October morning in 1887, the unthinkable happened. Sheriff Sullivan was found dead, his badge torn from his chest, his life cut short in what the new authorities called a tragic accident. His daughter Emma Sullivan refused to believe it. This is the story of a young woman who discovered that sometimes the badge doesn't make the man, and sometimes the greatest criminals hide behind the very symbols of justice they've sworn to uphold. Emma Sullivan was about to learn that seeking the truth could cost everything, including her life. Picture this: a town where corruption runs deeper than the gold mines, where the new sheriff has secrets darker than a moonless night, and where a determined daughter must choose between safety and justice. Emma had been raised on her father's principles, that right was right, wrong was wrong, and that a person's character was measured not by their position, but by their actions when no one was watching. But what happens when the person everyone trusts is the very person who destroyed everything you held dear? What you're about to hear isn't just a tale of revenge. It's a testament to the power of truth in the face of overwhelming odds. It's about the moment when a young woman realizes that sometimes justice won't come from the courts or the cavalry, but from the courage to stand up and speak truth to power, no matter the consequences. Emma Sullivan was raised to respect the law, but she was about to discover that sometimes the law and justice are two very different things. And when those two paths diverge, a person has to choose which one to follow, even if it means standing alone against an entire town that's been deceived. Some say that blood runs thicker than water, but Emma was about to prove that truth runs deeper than both. In a world where men with badges could be bought and sold like cattle, she carried something more valuable than any amount of gold: her father's legacy and the unshakable belief that justice, real justice, was worth any price. The confrontation you're about to witness changed Cedar Ridge forever, but it began with a simple question that haunted Emma Sullivan's dreams. If the new sheriff was so eager to close the case on her father's death, what exactly was he trying to hide? The morning Sheriff James Sullivan died. The air in Cedar Ridge carried an unseasonable chill that seemed to settle into everyone's bones. Emma Sullivan had been in the kitchen of their modest house behind the jail, preparing her father's usual breakfast of eggs, bacon, and strong black coffee, when she heard the gunshot that would change everything. It wasn't unusual to hear gunfire in Cedar Ridge. Men settled disputes with lead as often as with words, and her father was frequently called upon to restore order. But this shot was different. It came from too close to home, and it was followed by a silence so profound that even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Emma set down the coffee pot with trembling hands and rushed to the window. Through the morning mist, she could see a crowd gathering in the alley beside Murphy's saloon, their faces grave and their voices hushed. Her father was nowhere to be seen, though his morning rounds should have taken him past Murphy's at exactly this time. A cold dread settled in her stomach as she grabbed her shawl and hurried outside. The crowd parted respectfully as she approached. The folks of Cedar Ridge had known Emma since she was a child, and they understood that Sheriff Sullivan's daughter had a right to know what had happened. What she saw when the crowd cleared made her knees buckle. Her father lay sprawled in the narrow alley, his usually pristine sheriff's uniform dirty and torn. His badge, the six-pointed star he'd worn with such pride for 20 years, was missing from his chest, leaving only torn fabric behind. Blood pooled beneath his head, dark and still growing. "Emma, honey, you shouldn't see this," said Doc Harrison, kneeling beside her father's body. But Emma couldn't look away. Her father's eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the gray morning sky, and his right hand was extended as if reaching for something or someone. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Looks like he fell and hit his head," said a voice behind her. Emma turned to see Marcus Crane, the deputy who'd arrived in town just 6 months earlier. He was a tall man with cold gray eyes and a precisely groomed mustache, everything about him neat and calculated. Must have been chasing someone and lost his footing on those loose boards there. Emma looked at the boards Crane indicated. They were indeed loose, warped and dangerous in the morning dew. But something about the scene felt wrong to her. Her father had walked these streets for 20 years. He knew every loose board, every pothole, every hazard in Cedar Ridge like the back of his hand. "Where's his gun?" she asked suddenly. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Then Crane spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. "Must have fallen when he went down. These alleys are full of hiding places. Probably got kicked under something in all the commotion." Doc Harrison looked up from his examination, his weathered face troubled. "Emma, I'm sorry. There's nothing I could have done. The fall, the head injury was too severe." Emma nodded numbly, accepting the doctor's words even as her mind raced with questions. Her father had been in perfect health, his reflexes sharp, his step sure. James Sullivan didn't just fall down and die. "We'll need to investigate this thoroughly," Crane said, pulling out a small notebook. "Standard procedure. Emma, when did you last see your father?" "This morning before he left for his rounds," she replied automatically. "He had his usual breakfast, kissed my forehead, and told me he'd be back by noon for lunch." Crane scribbled notes, his expression sympathetic but businesslike. "And he seemed normal? Not distracted or worried about anything?" Emma started to say yes, then paused. Her father had been quieter than usual lately, spending long hours at his desk in the evening, reviewing old files and writing in his private journal. She'd assumed it was just the normal burden of keeping law and order in a frontier town, but now... "He'd been working late recently," she said carefully. "Going through old cases, I think, but he never talked about his work at home." "Good, good," Crane murmured, still writing. "That'll be helpful for the report." As the crowd began to disperse and Doc Harrison arranged for her father's body to be moved to the undertaker's, Emma found herself standing alone in the alley where her father had died. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning mist, and she could see the scene more clearly. That's when she noticed something the others had missed. Scratched into the dirt near where her father's outstretched hand had been, so faint that only someone looking for it would see it, were 3 letters: M.C.R. Emma's heart began to pound. Those weren't random scratches. They were too deliberate, too precise. Her father had written something in the dirt with his dying breath. M.C.R. What could it mean? She quickly scuffed dirt over the letters before anyone else could see them, her mind racing. Whatever her father had been trying to tell her, he'd wanted it kept secret. And if Deputy Crane was so eager to close this case as an accidental death, maybe there was a reason he didn't want anyone looking too closely at the evidence. Emma walked slowly back to the house she'd shared with her father, her mind churning with questions and suspicions. The kitchen still smelled like the breakfast he'd never returned to eat, and his coffee sat cold and untouched on the table. She began to notice things she'd overlooked in her shock. Her father's desk drawer was slightly open, though he always kept it locked. Papers that were usually neatly stacked were scattered. His private journal, which he wrote in every evening, was nowhere to be seen. Someone had been through her father's things. As the day wore on, neighbors and friends came to pay their respects and offer help. The mayor, John Wickham, assured her that Deputy Crane would be promoted to sheriff immediately to maintain order in the town. The banker, Samuel Morrison, offered to help her manage her father's affairs. Even Father Miguel from the Catholic Church stopped by to discuss funeral arrangements. But Emma noticed something odd about their visits. They all seemed more interested in asking about her father's recent activities than in offering genuine comfort. Had he mentioned any ongoing investigations? Was he working on anything unusual? Did he leave behind any files or notes? "Your father was a good man," Mayor Wickham said as he prepared to leave, "but sometimes good men can get in over their heads, if you know what I mean. It's probably best to let sleeping dogs lie and focus on moving forward." After the last visitor left, Emma sat alone in her father's study, surrounded by 20 years' worth of law enforcement records and personal effects. The room felt empty without his presence, but it also felt violated, as if strangers had been pawing through his most private thoughts. That's when she remembered the loose floorboard. When Emma was 12, her father had shown her a hiding place beneath a loose board in his study. "Every lawman needs a place to keep sensitive information," he told her. "Someday, if something happens to me, you might need to know where to look." At the time, she'd thought it was just another of her father's lessons about being prepared for anything. Now, with trembling hands, she pried up the board and found a small metal box hidden in the space beneath. Inside were documents she'd never seen before, correspondence with federal marshals, reports on suspected criminal activity in Cedar Ridge, and most importantly, a second journal written in her father's careful handwriting. As Emma began to read, her blood ran cold. The journal detailed months of investigation into corruption in Cedar Ridge, bribes, protection rackets, and illegal land deals that reached into the highest levels of town government. Her father had been building a case against what he called a conspiracy of thieves that had been bleeding the town dry. And on the last page, dated just 3 days before his death, was an entry that made Emma's hands shake. I have proof that MC has been taking money from the Morrison gang. Tomorrow I confront him with the evidence. If something happens to me, Emma must know that Marcus Crane cannot be trusted. He is not who he claims to be. Emma sank back in her father's chair, the journal clutched to her chest. MC, Marcus Crane. The same initials her father had scratched in the dirt with his dying breath. The new sheriff, the man everyone trusted to maintain order in Cedar Ridge, was the very person who had murdered her father to keep his crimes secret. As darkness fell over Cedar Ridge and the town settled into uneasy sleep, Emma Sullivan sat alone in her father's study and made a vow. She would find proof of Crane's guilt, and she would see that justice was served, even if she had to serve it herself. The law had failed her father, but she would not fail him. Outside her window, she could see the light burning in the sheriff's office, where Marcus Crane was no doubt going through her father's official files, destroying any evidence that might implicate him. But he didn't know about the hidden journal, and he didn't know that James Sullivan's daughter was now his most dangerous enemy. Emma opened the journal again and began to read every word, memorizing names, dates, and details. By morning, she would know everything her father had discovered about the corruption in Cedar Ridge. And then Marcus Crane would learn that killing Sheriff James Sullivan had only created a more determined enemy, one who wouldn't stop until the truth was revealed and justice was done. The game between them was just beginning, but Emma Sullivan was no longer the grieving daughter everyone pitied. She was her father's child, raised on principles of justice and truth, and she would not rest until his killer paid for what he'd done. Marcus Crane had made one fatal mistake. He'd assumed that killing the sheriff would end the investigation. Instead, it had just passed the badge as someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated. Someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Emma spent the night reading her father's hidden journal by candlelight, afraid that too much illumination might attract unwanted attention. With each page, the scope of corruption in Cedar Ridge became clearer and more horrifying. Her father hadn't just stumbled upon a few crooked deals. He'd uncovered a systematic criminal enterprise that had been operating under the town's nose for years. Marcus Crane wasn't just a corrupt deputy. According to her father's meticulous notes, he was an enforcer for the Morrison gang, a criminal organization that had been using Cedar Ridge as a base for their operations throughout the territory. The gang specialized in land fraud, cattle rustling, and protection rackets. But their greatest asset was having a man inside the law enforcement community. The journal revealed that Crane had arrived in Cedar Ridge 6 months ago with forged credentials and a fabricated backstory. He'd claimed to be a former deputy from Kansas, but James Sullivan's investigation had revealed no record of a Marcus Crane ever serving in law enforcement anywhere in Kansas. The man who now wore a badge was a complete fiction. But the most chilling discovery was how deep the corruption reached. Mayor Wickham, banker Morrison, and even several prominent merchants were all taking money from the gang in exchange for their silence and cooperation. Cedar Ridge hadn't just been infiltrated by criminals, it had been purchased by them. As dawn broke over the town, Emma closed the journal and began planning her next move. She couldn't go to the territorial authorities. Her father's notes indicated that the gang had connections there as well. She couldn't trust anyone in local government, and she certainly couldn't trust the new sheriff who had murdered her father to keep his secret safe. She would have to investigate on her own. Emma began by visiting her father's old friend, Tommy Clearwater, who ran the telegraph office. Tommy had known her since she was a child, and more importantly, he'd respected her father enough to help without asking too many questions. "Emma, I'm so sorry about your dad," Tommy said as she entered the small office. "He was the best lawman this territory ever had." "Thank you, Tommy. I need a favor. and I need you to keep it between us." The elderly telegraph operator studied her face and saw something there that reminded him strongly of her father, a determination that wouldn't be deterred. "What do you need?" "I want you to send inquiries to every sheriff's office in Kansas, asking about a deputy named Marcus Crane. I need to know if this man ever really worked in law enforcement." Tommy's eyebrows rose. "You thinking there's something not right about our new sheriff?" "I'm thinking my father didn't die in an accident," Emma said quietly. "And I'm thinking the person responsible is still walking around with a badge." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll send the telegrams today. But Emma, if you're right about this, you're in danger. These aren't the kind of men who leave loose ends untied." "I know, but I can't let my father's death go unpunished. He died trying to protect this town, and I'm going to finish what he started." Over the next few days, Emma began her own investigation, using skills her father had taught her and instincts she'd inherited from years of watching him work. She visited the general store, the saloon, and the livery stable, engaging in casual conversation while listening carefully for information about Marcus Crane and the Morrison gang. What she discovered was that people were afraid, though they tried to hide it. Shopkeepers mentioned customers who paid their bills in gold coins that looked suspiciously new. Ranchers talked about losing cattle to rustlers who never seemed to get caught. Travelers reported being robbed on roads that Sheriff Crane claimed were too dangerous for him to patrol alone. Emma also began following Crane's movements, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to see where he went and whom he met. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. 3 nights after her father's death, she watched from the shadows as Crane met with 2 men in the alley behind Murphy's saloon, the same alley where her father had died. The men were clearly outlaws, rough and hard-looking, with guns worn low on their hips and eyes that constantly scanned for trouble. Emma couldn't hear their conversation from her hiding place, but she could see money changing hands. Crane was receiving payment for something, and given the location of the meeting, she had a sick feeling she knew what it was for. The next morning, Tommy Clearwater had news for her. "Got responses from Kansas," he said, keeping his voice low as he handed her a stack of telegraph messages. "Emma, there's no record of a Marcus Crane ever working as a lawman anywhere in that state. More than that, 3 different sheriffs mentioned that they've had inquiries about this same man from other towns over the past 2 years. Emma's blood ran cold. "Other towns? Looks like our Mr. Crane has been moving from place to place, using the same false identity. Each time, he stays just long enough to get established, then moves on. Emma, this man is a professional criminal." That afternoon, Emma made a decision that would have terrified her a week earlier, but now seemed like the only logical course of action. She was going to confront Marcus Crane directly. She spent the evening preparing carefully. She cleaned and loaded her father's backup revolver, a Colt .45 that he'd taught her to shoot when she turned 16. She wrote a letter detailing everything she discovered and hid it in the same secret compartment where she'd found her father's journal. And she practiced what she would say, knowing she would likely only get one chance to catch Crane off guard. The next morning, Emma dressed in her best dress and walked boldly into the sheriff's office. Crane was sitting at her father's desk, going through files with the casual air of a man who had nothing to hide. "Miss Sullivan," he said, looking up with what appeared to be genuine sympathy, "how are you holding up? I know this must be a difficult time." "I'm managing, thank you," Emma replied, keeping her voice steady. "Actually, I wanted to thank you for taking over my father's duties so quickly. It must be challenging, stepping into his shoes." Crane's expression remained sympathetic, but Emma caught a brief flicker of something else. Relief, perhaps, or satisfaction. "Your father was a good man. I just hope I can live up to his example." "I'm sure you will," Emma said, then delivered her carefully planned words. "Especially since you have so much experience. Kansas must have prepared you well for the challenges of frontier law enforcement." For just a moment, Crane's mask slipped. His eyes sharpened, and his hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his gun before he caught himself. "Kansas? Yes, well, every place has its own challenges. Of course, I imagine Clay County was particularly difficult. My father always said that area had more than its share of trouble." Emma had chosen Clay County deliberately. It was one of the places that had specifically denied any knowledge of Marcus Crane. If he was truly from Kansas, he would know that Clay County was primarily agricultural, with relatively little crime. His response would tell her everything she needed to know. "Oh yes, Clay County," Crane said smoothly. "Terrible place for cattle rustling. We were constantly chasing outlaws through those hills." Emma felt a cold satisfaction. Clay County was flat prairie land with no hills to speak of. Marcus Crane had just confirmed that he was exactly what she suspected, a fraud and a killer. "Well, I won't keep you from your duties," she said, standing to leave. "I just wanted to express my gratitude for everything you're doing." "Of course, Miss Sullivan. And please, if there's anything you need, anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." As Emma walked toward the door, Crane spoke again. "Oh, and Miss Sullivan, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but I've noticed you've been asking questions around town about your father's death, about me. I understand grief can make people suspicious, but I'd hate for you to inadvertently spread rumors that might damage the respect people have for law enforcement." Emma turned back to face him, and for the first time she let him see the steel in her eyes. "Mr. Crane, my father taught me that the truth is never damaging to anyone except those who have something to hide." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats. Finally, Crane smiled, but it was a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Of course, truth is always important, but sometimes, Miss Sullivan, the truth can be dangerous for those who go looking for it in the wrong places." Emma met his gaze steadily. "My father also taught me that danger is just the price of doing what's right." She left the sheriff's office knowing that the game between them had moved to a new level. Crane now knew that she suspected him, and she knew that he was aware of her investigation. The careful dance of pretense was over. That evening, as Emma sat in her father's study reviewing his journal one more time, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. Someone was trying the front door. It was after 10 o'clock, and no honest visitor would come calling at such an hour. Emma quickly extinguished her lamp and crept to the window. In the moonlight, she could see 3 figures moving around her house, one at the front door, one at the back, and one positioned to watch the street. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. She had very little time. Emma grabbed her father's gun, the hidden journal, and the money she kept for emergencies. Moving as quietly as possible, she slipped out through the root cellar that connected to the storm shelter her father had built behind the house. As she emerged into the cold night air, she could hear the men breaking down her front door. Marcus Crane had decided that Emma Sullivan knew too much to live. But Emma was her father's daughter, and James Sullivan had taught her well. As she disappeared into the darkness beyond Cedar Ridge, she carried with her not just the evidence of Crane's crimes, but something even more dangerous: the absolute determination to see justice done, no matter what the cost. The hunt had begun, but Marcus Crane had made a crucial error. He'd assumed that a young woman would be easy prey. Instead, he'd unleashed something far more dangerous than any outlaw he'd ever faced: a person with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Emma Sullivan was no longer the grieving daughter seeking answers. She was justice itself, and she was coming for the man who had destroyed her family and corrupted her town. Emma spent the first night hiding in an abandoned mine shaft 3 miles outside Cedar Ridge, shivering in the darkness as she planned her next move. The men searching for her had torn her house apart looking for her father's evidence, but they'd found nothing because she had it all with her. Now she faced a terrible choice: flee the territory and try to start over somewhere else, or stay and fight a battle she might not survive. By dawn, her decision was made. Running would mean that Marcus Crane won, that her father's death went unpunished, and that the corruption would continue to destroy Cedar Ridge. Emma Sullivan wasn't built for running, but she also wasn't built for foolish heroics. Her father had taught her that victory came to those who were patient, careful, and smarter than their enemies. If she was going to take down Crane and his criminal organization, she would need allies, evidence that would convince the territorial authorities, and a plan that didn't end with her own death. Emma began by seeking out the one person in Cedar Ridge she thought she could trust: Father Miguel at the Catholic Church. The priest had known her family for years, and more importantly, he'd been one of the few people who hadn't asked suspicious questions about her father's recent activities. She waited until evening, then slipped through the shadows to the small adobe church on the edge of town. Father Miguel was alone, preparing for evening prayers, when Emma tapped softly on the side door. "Emma!" he exclaimed, keeping his voice low. "Child, where have you been? There are men looking for you everywhere, saying you've stolen important documents from the sheriff's office." "That's a lie, Father," Emma said firmly. "May I come in? I need sanctuary, and I need to tell you the truth about what happened to my father." The elderly priest looked into her eyes and saw something there that convinced him. He opened the door wider and ushered her inside, then barred it behind her. For the next hour, Emma told Father Miguel everything about her father's investigation, about Marcus Crane's true identity, about the corruption that had infected Cedar Ridge like a cancer. She showed him the hidden journal and the telegraph responses that proved Crane was a fraud. Father Miguel listened in growing horror. "Emma, if this is true, then none of us are safe. This Crane and his associates, they'll kill anyone who threatens them. I know, but Father, I can't let them win. My father died trying to protect this town, and I won't dishonor his memory by running away." The priest was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the weight of what she'd told him. Finally, he nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Help me get word to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe, someone who can't be bought or intimidated, and help me stay hidden until I can gather enough evidence to prove everything. The church has always been a sanctuary for those seeking justice," Father Miguel said. "But Emma, you must understand, if they discover you here, it won't just be your life at risk. They'll destroy the church, kill me, and hurt innocent people to get to you." Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Then I'll leave. I won't put others in danger for my fight." "No," Father Miguel said firmly. "I didn't say I wouldn't help. I said you needed to understand the risks. Your father once helped my nephew when he was falsely accused of theft. James Sullivan risked his career to find the real thief and clear an innocent man's name. I owe him that debt, and I'll help his daughter seek justice." Over the next 3 days, Emma lived in the hidden room beneath the church, while Father Miguel sent carefully worded messages to trusted contacts throughout the territory. The priest had connections with missionaries, church officials, and even some territorial authorities who had worked with the church on various matters. Meanwhile, Emma used her forced confinement to study her father's journal more carefully and plan her strategy. She memorized names, dates, and amounts of money. She identified patterns in the criminal activity and connections between seemingly unrelated crimes. Most importantly, she began to understand how the Morrison gang operated and where they might be vulnerable. The breakthrough came on the 4th day, when Father Miguel returned from town with disturbing news. "Emma, they're not just looking for you anymore. Marcus Crane has convinced the mayor and the town council that you've stolen important evidence and fled to join a gang of outlaws. He's posted a reward for your capture, dead or alive." Emma felt sick. "He's turning the whole town against me." "Not the whole town," Father Miguel said. "Some people remember your father and what he stood for. But Emma, there's more. Crane has sent word to Santa Fe, claiming that James Sullivan was actually working with criminals and that his death was the result of a falling out among thieves. He's trying to destroy your father's reputation before any investigation can begin." The enormity of Crane's ruthlessness hit Emma like a physical blow. It wasn't enough for him to murder her father. He was determined to destroy James Sullivan's memory and legacy as well. "That decides it," Emma said, standing up with new resolve. "I'm not hiding anymore. If Crane wants to play this game publicly, then we'll give the town a show they'll never forget." "Emma, what are you planning?" "I'm going to prove that Marcus Crane killed my father, and I'm going to do it in front of the whole town where everyone can see the truth." Father Miguel looked alarmed. "Child, that's suicide. Crane has the law on his side, at least officially. You'd be walking into a trap." "Maybe. But Father, sometimes the only way to expose a lie is to force the liar to defend it in public. My father taught me that truth has power, but only if people can see it clearly." That evening, Emma wrote 2 letters. The first was to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe, detailing everything she discovered and asking for an immediate investigation. She gave this letter to Father Miguel to send through his most trusted contacts. The second letter was addressed to the people of Cedar Ridge, and she planned to deliver it herself. Emma spent the night preparing for what might be her final confrontation with Marcus Crane. She cleaned her father's revolver and checked her ammunition. She rehearsed what she would say and how she would say it, and she made peace with the possibility that she might not survive the next day. At dawn, Emma Sullivan walked boldly down the main street of Cedar Ridge, her father's gun on her hip and his badge pinned to her dress. She'd found the badge in his personal effects, a duplicate he'd kept as a backup, and wearing it felt like carrying a piece of his strength with her. People stared as she passed, some with curiosity, others with fear. Word of her approach spread quickly, and by the time she reached the town square, a crowd had gathered. She could see Marcus Crane emerging from the sheriff's office, his hand already resting on his gun. "Emma Sullivan," Crane called out, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "You're under arrest for theft and conspiracy. Surrender yourself now, and I'll guarantee you'll make it to trial." Emma stopped in the center of the square, close enough to the crowd that everyone could hear her clearly. "Marcus Crane," she replied, her voice steady and strong. "You're not a sheriff, you're not a lawman, and you're not even Marcus Crane. You're a liar, a thief, and a murderer, and I'm here to prove it to everyone in Cedar Ridge." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people began backing away, sensing that violence was imminent. Others pressed closer, drawn by the drama unfolding before them. "You're talking nonsense," Crane said. But Emma caught the slight tremor in his voice. "Grief has clearly affected your mind. Put down your weapon and come quietly." Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "This is a telegraph from the sheriff of Clay County, Kansas, the place you claim to have worked. Would you like me to read it to everyone?" For the first time since she'd known him, Marcus Crane looked uncertain. "I don't know what kind of forgery you've—" "It says there's no record of a Marcus Crane ever working in law enforcement in Clay County," Emma interrupted, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "It says 3 other sheriffs have had inquiries about a man using that name, and that he's wanted for questioning in connection with the death of a sheriff in Colorado." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Emma could see Mayor Wickham and several other town officials pushing through the crowd, their faces pale with worry. "You're lying," Crane said, but his hand was now hovering directly over his gun. "Everyone knows you've been consorting with outlaws since your father's death." "The only outlaw here is you," Emma replied. "You killed my father because he discovered the truth about your criminal organization. You murdered Sheriff James Sullivan in that alley behind Murphy's Saloon, and then you tried to make it look like an accident." "Prove it," Crane snarled, abandoning all pretense of sympathy. Emma smiled grimly. "I intend to." She pulled out her father's hidden journal and held it high so everyone could see it. "This is my father's private investigation into corruption in Cedar Ridge. It contains evidence of bribes, protection rackets, and criminal conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of our local government. And it identifies you, Marcus Crane, as an enforcer for the Morrison gang." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and angry shouts. Some people were calling for Crane's arrest. Others were demanding to see the evidence. And still others were backing away as the situation spiraled toward violence. "That's enough," Crane shouted, drawing his gun. "You're under arrest, and if you resist, I'll shoot you down like the criminal you are." Emma didn't flinch. "Go ahead and shoot, Mr. Crane. Kill me in front of the whole town, just like you killed my father. Show everyone exactly what kind of man hides behind that badge." The tension in the square was so thick it was almost tangible. Crane's gun was pointed directly at Emma's chest, but she stood perfectly still, her hand resting on her own weapon, but not drawing it. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see which way the moment would break. That's when a new voice cut through the silence. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Crane." Everyone turned to see a tall man in a long coat walking into the square, a silver badge gleaming on his chest. Behind him came 3 more men, all armed and all wearing the unmistakable bearing of federal law enforcement. "I'm Marshal Robert Hayes from Santa Fe," the man announced. "And Marcus Crane, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and murder." Emma felt her knees nearly buckle with relief, but she forced herself to remain standing. The game was over, but she wanted to see how it ended. Crane's face had gone white with shock. "You can't prove anything. This woman is a liar and a thief." "Actually, we can prove quite a lot," Marshal Hayes replied calmly. "We've been investigating the Morrison gang for months, and we've been looking for their inside man in law enforcement. Thanks to some very detailed information we received from Father Miguel, we now know exactly who that is. The marshal's men began moving to surround Crane, but the false sheriff wasn't finished fighting. With a snarl of desperation, he turned his gun back toward Emma. "If I'm going down, I'm taking her with me." But Emma Sullivan was her father's daughter, trained in the ways of justice and prepared for this moment. Her hand moved with lightning speed, drawing her father's Colt and firing in one smooth motion. Marcus Crane's shot went wide, splintering the wooden sign above the general store. Emma's shot didn't miss. As the echoes of gunfire faded across the Cedar Ridge, Emma Sullivan stood alone in the town square. Smoke curling from her father's gun, justice finally served. Marcus Crane lay motionless in the dust of Cedar Ridge's main street, his fraudulent badge glinting in the morning sun beside his outstretched hand. Emma's shot had been true, not a killing shot, but one that shattered his gun arm and ended any chance he had of taking her life with him into whatever justice awaited. The silence that followed the gunfire was profound, broken only by Crane's groans of pain and the whispered prayers of some townspeople. Emma stood perfectly still, her father's smoking Colt still raised, her eyes never leaving the man who had murdered her father. Marshal Hayes moved forward cautiously, his own weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. "Miss Sullivan, you can lower your gun now. It's over." Emma's hand trembled slightly as she slowly lowered the Colt, the weight of what she'd just done settling over her like a heavy blanket. She'd shot a man, even a corrupt, murderous man, and the reality of that moment would stay with her forever. "Is he dead?" she asked quietly. "No," Hayes replied, kneeling beside Crane to examine the wound. "You put the bullet right through his shoulder. He'll live to stand trial, which is more than he deserves after what he did to your father." As the marshal's men secured Crane and called for Doc Harrison to tend his wound, the crowd that had gathered began to buzz with excited conversation. The truth was spreading like wildfire through Cedar Ridge. Their sheriff had been a fraud and a killer, and Sheriff Sullivan's daughter had exposed the corruption that had been poisoning their town. But Emma barely heard the voices around her. She was staring down at Marcus Crane, this man who had seemed so confident and controlled just minutes before, now bleeding and broken in the dirt. The sight gave her no satisfaction, only a hollow sense that something important had ended but could never be undone. "Emma," Marshal Hayes said gently, approaching her with obvious respect, "I need to ask you some questions about your father's investigation. But first I want you to know that what you did here took tremendous courage. James Sullivan would be proud of you." Emma looked up at the federal marshal, this man who represented the justice her father had served faithfully for 20 years. "How did you know to come here?" "I sent a letter, but—" "Father Miguel contacted us 3 days ago through the church hierarchy. He passed along your father's journal and the evidence you'd gathered. We were already on our way when your letter arrived." Hayes paused, his expression growing somber. "Miss Sullivan, your father's investigation was more important than you might realize. The Morrison gang has been operating throughout this territory for years, and we've been trying to build a case against them. Your father's work and your courage in preserving it has given us what we need to shut them down permanently." As Doc Harrison worked on Crane's wounded shoulder, preparing him for transport to the territorial prison, other members of the Morrison gang were being rounded up throughout Cedar Ridge. Mayor Wickham was arrested trying to flee town with a saddlebag full of gold coins. Banker Morrison was found in his office, burning documents that detailed the gang's money laundering operations. Several other prominent citizens found themselves in custody as the full scope of the corruption became clear. Emma watched it all with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, but it came at such a terrible cost. Her father was still dead, her home had been destroyed, and she was alone in a world that suddenly seemed much larger and more dangerous than before. "What happens now?" she asked Marshal Hayes as they sat in Father Miguel's rectory later that afternoon. "Now we prepare for the trials," Hayes replied. "The territorial court will want your testimony about your father's investigation and about what you witnessed. With the evidence from his journal and the arrests we've made today, we should be able to convict the entire organization." "And then?" Hayes studied her face carefully. "And then you'll have to decide what you want to do with the rest of your life. You're a hero, Miss Sullivan, but you're also a young woman who's lost everything she held dear. That's not an easy burden to carry. Emma was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question that had been haunting her since she'd fired that shot in the town square. Marshall, do you think my father would have wanted me to kill Marcus Crane? Your father was a lawman, Emma. He believed in justice through the courts, not through vigilante action. But he also understood that sometimes good people are forced to make hard choices in order to survive and protect others. Hayes leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. You didn't kill Crane, and you didn't shoot him out of revenge. You shot him because he was about to murder you in cold blood. That's not vigilante justice. That's self-defense. It doesn't feel like justice, Emma said quietly. It just feels empty. Father Miguel, who had been listening quietly from across the room, spoke up. Justice isn't supposed to feel good, my child. It's supposed to feel necessary. What you did today was necessary to protect yourself and to ensure that the truth about your father's death could be told. Over the following weeks, as Cedar Ridge slowly recovered from the shock of discovering how thoroughly it had been infiltrated by criminals, Emma found herself struggling with her role as the town's unlikely hero. People treated her with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. She was the brave daughter who had avenged her father's death, but she was also the young woman who had gunned down the sheriff in broad daylight. The trials, when they came, were swift and decisive. Marcus Crane, whose real name turned out to be Martin Collins, was convicted of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence from James Sullivan's journal, combined with testimony from gang members seeking to reduce their own sentences, painted a clear picture of a criminal organization that had operated with impunity for years. Crane was sentenced to hang, a punishment that Emma watched with a heart heavy with conflicted emotions. She felt no joy in seeing him die, but she knew it was justice for her father and for all the other victims of his crimes. The other conspirators received prison sentences of varying lengths. Mayor Wickham got 20 years for corruption and conspiracy. Banker Morrison got 15 years for money laundering. Several smaller fish in the criminal organization received shorter sentences in exchange for their cooperation. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when the territorial governor personally apologized to Emma for the failures that had allowed such corruption to flourish unchecked. He also announced that Cedar Ridge would receive federal funds to rebuild, and that a new sheriff, a man with impeccable credentials and no connections to any criminal organizations, would be appointed to restore law and order. As winter settled over Cedar Ridge, Emma faced a decision about her future. The house she'd shared with her father had been rebuilt with money from a fund established by grateful townspeople. But living there felt like dwelling in a museum of painful memories. Marshal Hayes had offered her a job with the Territorial Marshal Service. Her investigative skills and courage had impressed the federal authorities, and they believed she could make a real difference in law enforcement. It was an unprecedented offer for a woman in that time and place. But then again, Emma Sullivan had proven herself to be an unprecedented woman. I need time to think about it, she told Hayes when he made the offer. I've spent so much time focused on getting justice for my father that I haven't thought about what comes after justice. Take all the time you need, Hayes replied. But Emma, don't let your father's death define the rest of your life. He raised you to be strong and independent and capable of making your own choices. Honor his memory by building a life that would make him proud. One snowy evening in December, Emma sat in her father's study, now her study, reading a letter she'd received from a women's college in California. They'd heard about her story and were offering her a scholarship to study law, with the understanding that she would return to the frontier to practice as an attorney. It was an opportunity she'd never dared to dream of, but it would mean leaving Cedar Ridge, leaving the place where her father had lived and died and where she'd fought so hard for justice. As she pondered the decision, Emma found herself looking at her father's badge, which now sat in a place of honor on the desk. Beside it lay the Colt revolver that had served justice on that fateful day in the town square. Suddenly, Emma knew what her father would want her to do. James Sullivan had devoted his life to law and justice, but he'd also always told his daughter that the best way to fight injustice was through education and understanding, not just through force of arms. He would want her to study law, to become the kind of advocate who could prevent corruption before it took root, rather than simply punishing it after the damage was done. Emma picked up her pen and began writing her acceptance letter to the college. She would leave Cedar Ridge in the spring, but she would return someday as an attorney, armed with knowledge and legal training that would make her even more effective at fighting the kind of corruption that had killed her father. But first, she had one more letter to write. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began, "Dear Papa, it's been 3 months since you died, and 3 months since I shot the man who killed you. I want you to know that justice was served, that Marcus Crane and his associates will never hurt anyone again, and that Cedar Ridge is safe because of the investigation you started. I also want you to know that I'm leaving home to study law. I know you always wanted me to have opportunities you never had, and I think you'd be proud that I'm going to become an attorney. I'll use what I learned to fight for justice in a way that doesn't require guns or violence, the way you always preferred. I miss you every day, and I always will. But I'm not sad anymore. I'm grateful for the father you were, the lessons you taught me, and the strength you gave me to do what was right even when it was dangerous. Your daughter always, Emma." Emma sealed the letter in an envelope and walked outside into the snowy night. Behind the house, beneath a simple headstone that read, "James Sullivan, a good man and a true lawman," she placed the letter on her father's grave. The wind stirred the snow around the headstone, and for just a moment, Emma could almost hear her father's voice on the breeze, telling her he was proud of her and that she should go forward with confidence into whatever future awaited her. As she walked back to the house, Emma Sullivan felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death. Hope for tomorrow. Justice had been served, the truth had been told, and now it was time to build a life worthy of the man who had raised her to believe that right would always triumph over wrong, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. The territorial courthouse in Santa Fe was packed beyond capacity on the day Marcus Crane's trial began. Word of the corruption in Cedar Ridge had spread throughout the territory, and people came from hundreds of miles away to witness what newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Emma Sullivan sat in the front row, dressed in her finest black dress, her father's badge pinned prominently to her chest as a reminder of what was at stake. Crane, or Martin Collins, as the court records now identified him, sat at the defendant's table with his court-appointed attorney, a nervous young man who clearly understood that he was defending the indefensible. Collins' shoulder had healed well enough for him to stand trial, but he bore the permanent mark of Emma's bullet in the way he favored his left arm. The prosecutor, District Attorney William Hartwell, was a seasoned veteran who had built his career on bringing frontier criminals to justice. He'd studied James Sullivan's journal as if it were holy scripture, memorizing every detail and understanding that this case would either make or break his reputation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hartwell began his opening statement, "you are about to hear a story of corruption so deep and pervasive that it threatens the very foundation of law and order in our territory. You will learn how a group of criminals infiltrated the government of Cedar Ridge, how they murdered a good and honest sheriff to protect their crimes, and how that sheriff's daughter risked her own life to bring these criminals to justice." Emma listened as Hartwell outlined the case, describing her father's investigation and the evidence that had been gathered. But she found herself studying the faces of the jurors, trying to gauge their reactions. These were frontier men, ranchers and merchants and farmers who understood the importance of law and order in a land where civilization was still fragile. Collins' attorney, Thomas Mitchell, tried to paint a different picture in his opening statement. "My client may have used a false name," he admitted, "but that doesn't make him a murderer. The prosecution's case rests entirely on the word of a grief-stricken young woman who admits to shooting my client in broad daylight. Can we really trust the testimony of someone who took the law into her own hands?" Emma felt her cheeks burn with anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. She'd expected this line of attack, and she was prepared for it. The first day of testimony focused on establishing the scope of the corruption in Cedar Ridge. Mayor Wickham, now facing his own trial, had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony painted a devastating picture of how the Morrison gang had systematically taken control of the town's government. "They approached me about 6 months after Martin Collins arrived in town," Wickham testified, his voice barely above a whisper. "They said they could make certain business arrangements more profitable for everyone involved. At first, it was just small things, looking the other way when certain shipments came through town, making sure certain land deals went through without too many questions. And then, Hartwell prompted, then it escalated. They wanted me to help them gain control of more territory, more businesses. They said Sheriff Sullivan was becoming a problem, asking too many questions. Collins said he would handle it. Did Collins specifically say he was going to kill Sheriff Sullivan? Wickham hesitated, clearly struggling with the weight of his words. He said the sheriff needed to have an accident. He said some people were too stubborn to be reasoned with, and that sometimes accidents were the only way to solve persistent problems. The defense attorney objected, claiming hearsay, but the judge allowed the testimony to stand. Emma watched Collins' face during Wickham's testimony and saw no emotion whatsoever. No guilt, no remorse, not even anger. It was as if he were listening to someone discuss the weather. The second day brought testimony from the federal marshals who had investigated the Morrison gang's activities throughout the territory. They presented evidence of similar operations in other towns, all following the same pattern. Infiltrate local law enforcement, corrupt local officials, and eliminate anyone who posed a threat to the organization. The Morrison gang has been responsible for at least 12 deaths over the past 3 years, Marshal Hayes testified. In every case, the victim was a law enforcement officer, a government official, or a private citizen who had discovered evidence of the gang's criminal activities. And in how many of these cases was Martin Collins present in the area when the death occurred? Hartwell asked. In 9 of the 12 cases, Hayes replied. Collins would arrive in a town under a false identity, establish himself in a position of trust, and then eliminate any threats to the gang's operations before moving on to the next target. The third day was when Emma's testimony was scheduled, and she had spent the previous night reviewing her father's journal one final time. She wanted to make sure she could present every detail accurately, knowing that Collins' freedom or execution might depend on her ability to convince the jury of the truth. When she was called to the witness stand, Emma felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon her. She dressed carefully for this moment, wearing the same dress she'd worn on the day she confronted Collins in Cedar Ridge's town square, with her father's badge once again pinned to her chest. Miss Sullivan, Hartwell began gently, please tell the court about your father's work in the weeks before his death. Emma took a deep breath and began the story she'd told so many times in her mind. She described her father's late nights, his careful investigation, and his growing concern about corruption in Cedar Ridge. She detailed the evidence she'd found in his hidden journal and the circumstances surrounding his death. Your father scratched the letters MCR in the dirt beside his body, Hartwell said. What did you believe those letters meant? Marcus Crane, Emma replied firmly. My father was trying to tell me who had killed him. Collins' attorney rose for cross-examination, and Emma steeled herself for the attack she knew was coming. Miss Sullivan, you admit that you shot my client in broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses. Isn't it true that you were seeking revenge for your father's death, regardless of my client's actual guilt or innocence? No, Emma replied calmly. I shot Mr. Collins because he was about to murder me after I had exposed his crimes to the town. It was self-defense, not revenge. But you had already decided he was guilty before you confronted him, hadn't you? You had already appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner. Emma felt her temper flare, but she kept her voice steady. I had evidence that he was guilty. I presented that evidence publicly so that the people of Cedar Ridge could see the truth. Mr. Collins chose to respond with violence rather than addressing the accusations. Evidence that consisted entirely of your interpretation of some scratches in the dirt and a journal that could have been written by anyone. The journal was in my father's handwriting, contained information that only he could have known, and was corroborated by telegraph records and witness testimony, Emma shot back. And those weren't random scratches in the dirt. They were my father's dying attempt to identify his killer. The cross-examination continued for another hour, with Collins' attorney trying to paint Emma as a vengeful daughter who had let grief cloud her judgment. But Emma's calm, detailed responses and her obvious knowledge of the facts began to turn the courtroom in her favor. The fourth day brought the most dramatic testimony of all, from members of the Morrison gang who had agreed to testify against Collins in exchange for reduced sentences. One after another, they described Collins' role in the organization and his specific involvement in James Sullivan's murder. Collins told us Sullivan was getting too close to the truth, testified Jake Morrison, the gang's former second-in-command. He said he tried to warn Sullivan off, but the sheriff wouldn't listen. Collins said there was only one way to handle lawmen who couldn't be bought or scared. Did Collins describe how he planned to kill Sheriff Sullivan? Hartwell asked. He said he'd make it look like an accident. Said he'd done it before in other towns, and nobody ever suspected a thing. He was real proud of how clever he was about it. And did Collins describe the actual murder to you? Morrison nodded grimly. He said he lured Sullivan into that alley by telling him he had information about the gang's operations. When Sullivan got close enough, Collins hit him with a blackjack and then bashed his head against those loose boards to make it look like he'd fallen. Emma felt sick hearing the details of her father's death, but she forced herself to listen. This was the truth she'd fought so hard to uncover, and she owed it to her father's memory to hear every word. The final day of testimony brought character witnesses for both sides. The prosecution presented a parade of people from Cedar Ridge who testified to James Sullivan's integrity and dedication to justice. They described him as an honest lawman who couldn't be corrupted or intimidated, a man who had devoted his life to protecting his community. The defense called character witnesses for Collins, but their testimony rang hollow. They could only speak to his behavior during the 6 months he'd spent in Cedar Ridge, and even then, their praise was lukewarm and unconvincing. In his closing argument, Hartwell pulled no punches. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case is overwhelming. Martin Collins, operating under the false identity of Marcus Crane, murdered Sheriff James Sullivan to prevent him from exposing a criminal conspiracy that had corrupted the government of Cedar Ridge. The defendant is a professional killer who has left a trail of dead lawmen across 3 territories. Justice demands that this trail of murder end here, in this courtroom, with your verdict. Collins' attorney made a valiant effort in his closing, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that the prosecution had failed to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. But even he seemed to lack conviction in his words. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. We find the defendant, Martin Collins, guilty of murder in the first degree. Emma felt her knees go weak with relief. After months of investigation, confrontation, and legal proceedings, justice had finally been served. Her father's killer would pay for his crimes. Judge Harrison sentenced Collins to death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. As the court officers led Collins away in shackles, he turned to look at Emma one final time. There was still no emotion in his eyes, no sign of remorse or regret. He was exactly what her father's investigation had revealed, a cold-blooded killer who felt nothing for the lives he destroyed. Outside the courthouse, Emma was surrounded by reporters and well-wishers who wanted to congratulate her on her victory. But she felt no triumph, only a deep exhaustion and the knowledge that while justice had been served, nothing could bring her father back. "Miss Sullivan," called out a reporter from the Santa Fe newspaper, "how does it feel to have gotten justice for your father?" Emma considered the question carefully before answering. "Justice doesn't feel like victory," she said finally. "It feels like necessity. My father died protecting his community, and ensuring that his killer faced the consequences of that crime was simply what had to be done." As she walked away from the courthouse, Emma Sullivan felt a chapter of her life closing and a new one beginning. The trials were over, the criminals were facing justice, and she was free to pursue whatever future she chose. But she would never forget the lesson her father had taught her through his life and death. That justice was not something that happened automatically, but something that good people had to fight for every single day, no matter the cost. 3 weeks after the trial ended, Emma Sullivan stood on the platform at the Santa Fe train station, a single suitcase in her hand and a ticket to California in her pocket. The acceptance letter from the Women's College was carefully folded in her reticule, along with a bank draft that represented the sale of her father's house and the reward money the territorial government had given her for her role in exposing the Morrison gang. Marshall Hayes had come to see her off, along with Father Miguel and several other friends she'd made during her months of seeking justice for her father. It felt strange to be leaving the territory where she'd been born and raised, but Emma knew it was the right decision. "You sure about this, Emma?" Hayes asked as they waited for the train to arrive. "The offer to join the Marshal Service is still open. We could use someone with your investigative skills and courage." Emma smiled at the man who had become like an uncle to her over the past months. I'm sure, Robert. My father always said that the best way to fight crime was to prevent it from happening in the first place. Studying law will give me the tools to do that more effectively than wearing a badge ever could. Father Miguel nodded approvingly. Your father would be proud of your choice, my child. Education is a powerful weapon against injustice. As the train whistle sounded in the distance, Emma felt a mixture of excitement and sadness. She was leaving behind everything familiar to pursue a dream she'd never dared imagine before her father's death. But she was also leaving behind his grave, the town where they'd built their life together, and the last physical connections to the man who had shaped her into the woman she'd become. I'll write often, she promised her friends, and I'll be back. This territory's my home, and someday I'll return to practice law here. The train pulled into the station with a great hissing of steam and squealing of brakes. Emma hugged her friends goodbye, then climbed aboard the passenger car that would take her away from her old life and toward her new future. As the train pulled out of Santa Fe, Emma pressed her face to the window and watched the familiar landscape of New Mexico territory roll past. She thought about the girl who had prepared breakfast for her father on that fateful morning just a few months ago. That Emma had been naive, sheltered, dependent on others for protection and guidance. The woman sitting on this train was someone entirely different. The journey to California took 5 days, and Emma used the time to think about what lay ahead. She would be one of only a dozen women in the law program, studying alongside men who might resent her presence or question her abilities. She would have to prove herself every day, not just as a student, but as a woman who belonged in a profession that had traditionally excluded her gender. But Emma had learned something valuable during her fight for justice in Cedar Ridge. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined, smarter than most people gave her credit for, and absolutely unwilling to be intimidated by anyone who tried to stand in her way. The California Women's College was located in a small town called Riverside, about 60 miles east of Los Angeles. It was a progressive institution that had been founded by wealthy philanthropists who believed women deserved the same educational opportunities as men. The campus was beautiful, with Spanish-style buildings surrounded by orange groves and gardens that bloomed year-round in the mild California climate. Emma's dormitory room was small but comfortable, with a desk by the window where she could study while looking out at the mountains in the distance. Her roommate was a young woman named Sarah Chen, whose family had immigrated from China and who was studying to become a teacher. I heard about you, Sarah said on Emma's first day. You're the one who caught her father's killer. That took incredible courage. Emma was touched by Sarah's straightforward admiration. It took stubbornness more than courage, she replied. I just couldn't let him get away with it. The law program was more challenging than Emma had expected, but she threw herself into her studies with the same determination she'd brought to investigating her father's murder. She studied constitutional law, criminal procedure, civil rights, and legal writing. She learned about the great legal precedents that had shaped American jurisprudence and the ongoing debates about justice and equality that would define the future of the legal profession. Her professors were initially skeptical of having a woman in their classes, but Emma's performance quickly won their respect. She had a natural talent for legal reasoning and an intuitive understanding of how laws affected real people's lives. Her experiences with the corruption in Cedar Ridge gave her insights into the practical applications of legal theory that her classmates lacked. Miss Sullivan, Professor Williams said after one particularly impressive performance in a mock trial, you have a gift for advocacy. Have you considered specializing in criminal law? Actually, I'm more interested in civil rights and government accountability, Emma replied. I want to work on preventing the kind of corruption that killed my father, not just prosecuting it after the fact. During her second year of study, Emma received a letter that would change the direction of her life once again. It was from Marshall Hayes, writing to inform her that the territorial government was creating a new position, an inspector general who would investigate allegations of corruption in local governments and recommend reforms to prevent future problems. They want someone with legal training who also has practical experience with corruption investigations, Hayes wrote. Your name was the first one that came up when they asked for recommendations. The job would be based in Santa Fe, but you'd travel throughout the territory investigating complaints and working with local officials to implement better oversight procedures. Emma read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. This was exactly the kind of work she dreamed of doing, using legal knowledge to prevent corruption before it could take root, rather than simply punishing it after innocent people had been hurt. She wrote back immediately, expressing her interest but explaining that she wanted to finish her law degree first. The territorial government agreed to hold the position open for her, understanding that her formal legal training would make her more effective in the role. Emma graduated summa cum laude from the California Women's College in the spring of 1890, 3 years after her father's death. She was the first woman to complete the law program, and her thesis on government accountability and corruption prevention was praised by her professors as groundbreaking work. At her graduation ceremony, Emma wore a new dress, but also carried something from her past: her father's badge, polished to a bright shine and pinned to her academic robes. Several people asked her about it, and she explained that it represented the legacy she was carrying forward. "My father believed that justice was not something that happened automatically," she told a reporter from the college newspaper. "He taught me that good people have to fight for justice every day, in every way they can. My fight just uses different weapons than his did." The train ride back to New Mexico territory felt like a homecoming. Emma had grown and changed during her years in California, but the landscape of her childhood still moved her in ways that no other place could. The vast skies, the rugged mountains, the sense of endless possibility that characterized the frontier, these were the things that had shaped her character and given her the strength to fight for what was right. Cedar Ridge had changed too during her absence. The corruption had been rooted out completely, and the town was thriving under honest leadership. A new sheriff, a man named Tom Bradley, who had previously served with distinction in Colorado, had restored the community's faith in law enforcement. The businesses that had been extorted by the Morrison gang were prospering again, and new families were moving to the area, drawn by reports of its recovery. Emma's first stop was her father's grave, which was now marked by a more elaborate headstone that the townspeople had erected in his honor. The inscription read, "James Sullivan, he died for justice, he lives in memory." "Hello, Papa," Emma said, kneeling beside the grave and placing a bouquet of wildflowers on the headstone. "I'm back, and I'm ready to continue your work. I think you would be proud of what I've learned and what I plan to do with it." The wind rustled through the trees that surrounded the cemetery, and for a moment, Emma could almost hear her father's voice telling her he was indeed proud of the woman she'd become. Her new office was in the Territorial Capitol building in Santa Fe, with a view of the plaza where she'd first met Marshal Hayes. The nameplate on her door read, "Emma Sullivan, Inspector General," and seeing it there gave her a deep sense of satisfaction. Her first case involved investigating allegations of election fraud in a small town near the Colorado border. It was exactly the kind of preventive work she dreamed of doing, catching corruption before it could spread and destroy a community's faith in honest government. As Emma packed her investigative materials and prepared to travel to her first assignment, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, she'd been a sheltered young woman whose greatest ambition was to help her father with his paperwork. Now she was an attorney, an investigator, and a guardian of justice in her own right. The morning she left Santa Fe for her first official investigation, Emma wore her father's badge pinned to her jacket, just as she had on that day in Cedar Ridge when she'd confronted Marcus Crane. But now the badge represented something different, not vengeance or the settling of old scores, but the ongoing work of building a society where justice was not the exception, but the rule. Emma Sullivan had learned that justice was not a destination, but a journey, not a single victory, but a daily commitment to standing up for what was right. Her father had started her on that journey with his example and his sacrifice. Now it was her turn to carry the torch forward, using the law as her weapon and education as her shield. As her carriage rolled across the New Mexico landscape toward her first case, Emma felt the presence of her father's spirit traveling with her. James Sullivan's work was finally complete, not because his killer had been punished, but because his daughter had become the kind of person who would carry on his legacy of fighting for justice, one case at a time, for the rest of her life. The badge on her jacket caught the morning sunlight as the carriage headed toward the horizon, carrying Emma Sullivan toward whatever challenges awaited her in the ongoing battle between right and wrong that defined life on the American frontier. And so the daughter became the guardian her father had always meant her to be. Emma Sullivan's transformation from sheltered young woman to fierce advocate for justice proved that sometimes our greatest tragedies can forge us into the people we were always meant to become. The corruption that killed Sheriff James Sullivan had been rooted out of Cedar Ridge, but Emma understood that the fight for honest government was never truly finished. In town after town across the territory, she would find evidence of the same patterns her father had discovered. Ambitious criminals seeking to exploit the trust that frontier communities placed in their leaders. But Emma brought something to this fight that her father never could have. The perspective of someone who had seen corruption destroy everything she loved, and the legal knowledge to prevent that destruction from happening to others. Her work as Inspector General would save countless communities from the fate that had befallen Cedar Ridge. Years later, when Emma Sullivan became the first woman admitted to the territorial bar and eventually the first female judge in New Mexico, she would always keep her father's badge displayed prominently in her chambers. Lawyers arguing cases before her learned that Judge Sullivan had no patience for corruption, no tolerance for those who would abuse positions of trust, and an unwavering commitment to the principle that justice should be available to all, regardless of their wealth or social position. The story of Emma Sullivan reminds us that justice is not something that happens automatically. It requires people of courage and principle who are willing to stand up to corruption, even when doing so puts them at great personal risk. Her father taught her that truth has power, but only if someone is brave enough to speak it aloud, regardless of the consequences. In a world where it would have been easy to flee, to start over somewhere else under a new identity, Emma chose to fight. She chose to trust that good people would recognize the truth when they saw it, and that courage, properly applied, could triumph over corruption and violence. The badge she wore, the gun she fired, and the education she pursued were all tools in service of a simple but powerful idea: that right is right, wrong is wrong, and that ordinary people have the power to make sure justice prevails, even in the darkest circumstances. Emma Sullivan's story echoes across the generations, reminding us that every community needs its guardians, every generation needs its heroes, and every injustice needs someone brave enough to shine a light on it, no matter how dangerous that light might be for those who prefer to operate in darkness. Sometimes the most important badge a person can wear is not one given by any government, but the invisible badge of conscience, the commitment to stand for truth and justice, even when standing alone, even when the cost seems too high to bear. The spirit of Sheriff James Sullivan lived on in his daughter's work, proving that love, courage, and an unshakable commitment to justice are the most powerful inheritance any parent can leave their child.